Good morning, everyone. We thank you for joining our session, which is on preventing homelessness through stronger rental protection. You can already see that in the slide. And we are so excited to see so many of you here. I would begin with an acknowledgement, and I would like to begin by saying that we are gathered here today at Jojoge, today known as Montreal, on the unceded traditional lands of the Ghanaian Gehaga Mohawk Nation, who are the caretakers of these lands and waters. Jojoge has been a gathering place for many First Peoples, including Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Huron-Wendat. Their relationships with this land continue to this day, shaping its history. As we enter the discussion, let us remember that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit persons in this country are disproportionately impacted by Canada's housing crisis. And to move forward in human rights, we must center our work in truth, reconciliation, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I invite you all to reflect together to center justice and repair in our work to end homelessness. My name is Ambalika Roy, and I work with the National Right to Housing Network. Let me also take this opportunity to introduce who we are. So I'll move on to the next slide. I hope that works. And it worked. Okay, great. So National Right to Housing Network brings together over 2,000 advocates, partner organizations, and rights claimants to advance the human right to housing in Canada. And our organization and colleagues have been integral to securing the legal commitments that we currently have in Canada around right to housing, and we are very proud of that. We act as a connective tissue for the housing justice movement. In today's session, me and NRHN's Executive Director, Michelle Bass, is going to be co-sharing the session, along with our wonderful colleagues, Sarah Bayer and Yutaka Dirks from the Canadian Centre for Housing Rights, whom I would introduce in a bit. Okay, so let me start by introducing Sarah. Sarah is a policy professional with background in community work. She has experience of working in not-profit, public and private sectors, where she has focused her practice on housing affordability and Indigenous settler relations. Sarah is currently the Manager of Policy with Canadian Centre for Housing Rights. We welcome Sarah, and we'll hear from her very soon. And I have Yutaka, who is a member of the policy team at the CCHR, Canadian Centre for Housing Rights, and has been involved in housing and homelessness advocacy for the past 25 years in cities across Canada, including Calgary, Toronto, and Winnipeg. We welcome Yutaka as well. Okay, and now I will hand over to Sarah just to introduce CCHR as well, so I'll just get to the next slide.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Ambalika. Can everyone hear me here? So the Canadian Centre for Housing Rights, we work at the intersection of housing and human rights, and we do this through a few different ways. So we provide free services for renters facing evictions and human rights violations to remain housed. We provide education and training about housing rights across Canada, and we advance rights-based housing policy through research, policy development, advocacy, and law reform. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, so we'll share the agenda for this session. As you can see, it's an integrated session. So this is all we're going to discuss today in around 1.5 hours, with some time for question and answers as well. So we'll begin with understanding what right to housing is, especially what Canada's commitment to right to housing is. We'll talk about the new mechanism, which is under the National Housing Strategy Act, which recognizes housing as a fundamental human right. Then Sarah and Yutaka are going to talk about disparities in rental protections across the province. It's not uniform, as many of you know here already. So we're going to reflect on that. And finally, we'll talk about Canada's blueprint for Renters' Bill of Rights, which is a very critical law. It's a need of the hour, and we'll tell you why we need it. It's going to be a reiteration because many of you already know that. And finally, we'll end with a call to action that what we can do to bring this Bill of Rights actually see the light of the day, and also what should be our advocacy focus on that. Okay, so let us begin with a very broader question before even we delve into the micro and the macro pieces of right to housing. So here is a question for you. What is one word that you think when you hear right to housing. And what we have done is we have become very tech savvy. So we have a Mentimeter here, like a QR code that you can see. Please use it, and there's a link as well. So I think it should work because we just tested. So if you can go there and write in one word, it's a word cloud. So maybe you can write, what do you think when you hear about right to housing? And then we can actually show what you wrote, of course, anonymously. So yeah. Great, it worked. Okay, wonderful. So we see here accountability, security, stability, humanity, fundamental, self-worth, human, and it keeps moving on my screen, so I'm kind of probably repeating some of the words. Human right, expensive, yes. Fundamental, a dream, human right, access. So yes, all of them are true, and we're going to kind of delve into it a little bit more deeper. But yes, that's what we think of right to housing when we hear one word. I think we need to change the screen again. Okay, thanks, Michelle.
I know, look at our tech skills.
You're getting better. Next would be even better.
Killing it.
Thanks. Thanks.
Okay, so let me do some context setting before we delve into the session and take a look from where right to housing comes from. And I know in this room, many of you are well aware of where it comes from, so I'll promise I'll be very quick. So the UN Declaration of the Human Rights, which was passed in 1948, is the key source of all our rights. It's a written document, and countries have signed it, including Canada. And what that means that they have agreed to these rights. So it is a common standard for fundamental and international human rights and freedoms to protect all people, irrespective of who they are, where they come from, their religion, sex, ethnicity, etc., etc. So this declaration introduces right to adequate housing as one of the components of adequate standard of living. So that's the first declaration that we saw right to housing reference there. Then rights were divided into two sets. It was not, it should have been uniform in one, but there were a lot of reasons. I'm not going into those reasons right now. So we have a civil and political rights, which is rights like right to life, equality before law, freedom of expression. And we have a second set, which is the economic, social, and cultural rights. Right to education, right to adequate housing, and right to work. So right to housing falls in the second category, like the economic, social, and cultural rights bucket. So as usual, there were two sets of rights, or two conventions brought forward. So the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which came into existence in 1966, and you see the year 1976 when Canada ratified it, and that's a legal term, but that means that Canada agreed to these rights and has obligations to implement them. So we do have a commitment since 1976. Also, human right to housing human rights are evolving, so we are talking about 1948, 1966, 1976, but it is evolving. It is very, very relevant today, and as you see in 2010, another very important covenant was passed and signed. It's called International Covenant on Rights of the Persons with Disabilities, which protects rights and freedoms of persons with disabilities. So it is evolving, human rights is evolving. It's just to give you the reference, and we have some of the elements which are very crucial to housing in that convention as well. Okay, let me go to the next slide, get into a little deeper about what right to housing means. So these are the 7 elements of right to housing. And we say these are the 7 essential elements to right to adequate housing. As you can see, I'm not reading them out. But in short, what they can mean is you have the right to stay in your home unless you break terms of your rental agreement, which means that there's a security of tenure, which you see in these 7 elements, legal security of tenure. It means you have a right to safe, accessible, and affordable home, which is a dream. And also, you don't have to sacrifice your basic needs like food or healthcare to have a roof over your head. So that's also definitely within this 7 essential elements that we are talking about. Your home should meet your accessibility needs. Everybody has their different accessibility needs, which is a very crucial element of right to housing as well. It should be close to your schools, work, and other essential services. That's why you have here the location. And should be properly maintained, which is under the habitability aspect of the essential element. So that's what right to housing means in a nutshell. But one more important thing is also here to note that economic and social cultural rights are progressively realized. So again, it's again a heavy term, but what that means is government must use their maximum resources within the possible shortest time to fulfill all of these rights about the 7 components that we spoke about. So that means that it should ensure that it meets the need of the people who are most affected. So shortest possible time, they have to fulfill these rights, meets the need of the people who are most affected, and this should be something that should be there in all the policies that we see and which we work on. So for a wealthy nation such as Canada, this is also should not come as a surprise that is expected to achieve more than a country with fewer resources. So there is more to right to housing than all the 7 elements, so which we want to stress upon as well. There are equally relevant obligations of the government to ensure sound access to justice, which is a very, very integral part of the 7 elements, and also when we say we want to realize right to housing. Tax measures, participatory policy, and planning processes and regulatory investors. Big words, but I think all of you probably are working on several of this. So it doesn't mean only the 7 elements, but also we should have a proper access to justice to access these rights, to fulfill and realize these rights. That's something very critical. Okay, now I move on to my next slide, where, oh, it didn't move. Okay, it did. So this is something very critical to any human rights. It's not just rights written in some paper. It is also, it should be realized and it should be monitored. So we'll talk about a little bit of the mechanism or the bodies which has the power to measure whether Canada is in the right path or measure Canada's progress in fulfilling all these human rights commitments that we spoke in the last slides. So international mechanisms monitor countries to make sure that they are in the right path, doing enough to realize right to housing and other human rights commitments. We have the treaty bodies who reviews Canada every 5 years. It's about its progress, about how it's doing about its right to housing commitments. There is a special rapporteur who are human rights experts. For example, there's a UN Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing, which many of you already know probably, and there has been excellent reports and policy recommendations from their office. These are international commitments, are legally binding as well. So this is where we are talking about the access to justice mechanism, because it can't be just rights or a rallying cry. It's also something which we have value when we understand how it impacts our lives. So many people even ask that after even being reviewed and providing concluding observations in different mechanisms that we are speaking today, what are human rights when you can't access it? And which is a very, very valid question, that we can have several rights written in several books or in documents, but what does it mean if we can't really access it? So, despite Canada ratifying the Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights in 1976, which is like, I'm not very good in maths, but I think it's around probably 30, 40 years or maybe more. The right to adequate housing was not really legislated until 2019. And we got a law, it's called National Housing Strategy Act, which can talk about a little bit about that as well. So here is a reminder that what advocacy can bring forward, and in this entire conference we are hearing about several innovative initiatives, advocacy, different wins. It might be small, but it's important to celebrate our wins as well. So let's do that. So let's celebrate the wins of the right to housing movement. So here is a landmark case, which many of you in this room might be already aware of or had been part of that case, because it didn't had one person or one organization. There were several people around the country who were responsible for bringing this. So it was the first constitutional challenge before the courts, arguing how homelessness is a right to life issue, which is still a right to life issue, and kind of making that argument before the court. So in 2012, in the case of Tanujaja, where the petitioner, the Jennifer Tanujaja and 4 others who had experienced in different ways significant housing insecurity, along with organizations called CERA, Center for Rights for
Equality, Rights, and Accommodation. You got it.
Yes, I got it. Okay, good. I worked there as well. See, I mean, but around. But now it's called Canadian Center for Housing Rights, and we have Sarah and Yotaka from there, who they were one of the petitioners in the case. They intervened in the case, claimed that both government action and inaction were responsible for Canada's inadequate housing and homelessness crisis that we see. It was argued that it violates Canadian Charter, especially Section 7, which outlines the right to life and security of the persons. They argued that government failed to fulfill their obligations to address homelessness and violated the right to equality. Believe me, there were 900 pages of evidence which was filed before the courts, but despite 1,000 pages of evidence filed by an extensive team of grassroots organizations and advocates, the case was ultimately dismissed in 2014, and the evidence was not even reviewed when appealed in the Superior Court, because the Superior Court also dismissed. It was disappointing. I'm sure it was disappointing for all the people who worked on it, for several people who could have had a lot of impact of that decision. And it was also interpreted in even later cases that people living in the homelessness almost do not have charter protections like other Canadians, which is shocking and unacceptable, and also it is definitely against the law. So what happened next was a strategic advocacy that led by several housing advocates, experts, and organizations who actively engaged with the United Nations mechanisms to bring forward Canada's not taking action towards the commitment that it had already made in 1976 around right to adequate housing. And in 2015, finally, there was, after the new government came to power, there was some openness to implement right to housing. We got the 2017 National Housing Strategy document, which is the policy document which talks about all the policies, programs on housing in Canada and how government will implement them. And after rigorous advocacy and the efforts of the civil society and sharing a draft of the law, which is the National Housing Strategy Act, we saw the tabling of the National Housing Strategy Act in 2019. And it's the first human rights law on right to housing. So there is a reason to celebrate for sure. And let's look what this law says, which is a unique law. It talks about an access to justice mechanism, which is very, very important, and also it's very unique in its nature. So in 2019, this groundbreaking move happened by passing the National Housing Strategy Act. It establishes that housing is a human right, fundamental, which you can see in that quote. It introduces a parallel access to justice mechanism, which includes a federal housing advocate, a national housing council, and a review panel, which can hear systemic housing issues. And by systemic housing issues, we mean that any housing issues which affects not one person but many in communities, like when we talk about financialization of housing, or we talk about discrimination in housing based by newcomers, when we talk about lack of accessibility in housing. So there could be different, but it's a systemic issue that it can look into. It can hear from the rights holders, make recommendations, and recommendation would be aligned to the international human rights law. Again, that's Canada's commitment. And send recommendation to the Minister of Housing. So it is not that they have the recommendations and that lying somewhere. It goes to the Minister of Housing, who has to take action as well and have to respond them. And it's time stipulated, so within 120 days, the minister has to respond. So we'll just before I hand it over to Sarah, or I think it's Utaka first. So I'll just kind of quickly go over what the mechanism looks like. So this is the National Housing Council, which is one of the bodies under this law. So it's an advisory body, and it brings people from across Canada, including people with lived experience, community advocates, other housing advocates, and check how housing policies are actually working in practice. And the council advises the Minister of Housing to ensure that Canada realizes right to housing progressively again, with time, but shortest possible time, using the maximum available resources, and focusing on the people who need it the most. And also response to the needs of the people, like especially who are most impacted. Then comes the Federal Housing Advocate. And the Federal Housing Advocate is an independent, non-partisan watchdog who can hold the governments accountable for right to housing commitments. And it's set up under the Canadian Human Rights Commission, which many of you probably already know. And I don't see Mary Jose here, but yeah, she was here a few moments back. So Mary Jose Hull is our first and the current federal housing advocate, who is a key driver for bringing systemic change in housing issues, conduct research, receive testimony, and of course, monitor how the law is being implemented, because a law can be, developed, but the most important part is the accountability part of it, the implementation. So that's there is a responsibility on the federal housing advocate. We have the review panels, which is another very unique feature. So it consists of the 3 members from the National Housing Council. It could be, and they can actually convene to hear about human rights cases, human rights systemic issues. The review panels are an important oversight mechanism. It can hold public hearings as well, oral, and also can receive written submissions and testimonies from different people like tenants, unhoused people, advocates, experts. So, and then issues for the farmer, and then they can actually develop recommendations aligned on the human rights commitment that Canada has, and make those recommendations sent to the Minister of Housing, who must respond within the 120 days. So everything, it's like it's a cycle. So obviously, it's not that you are just appearing before the review panel stating about your case or the cause, but there is after effect of it also. There's a recommendations, and yesterday I think there was one of the panel that we heard about the second review panel, which was around barriers faced by women and gender diverse folks around housing. So it is happening. So it does work. So the recommendations made by the review panel helps people to identify solutions that are necessary to reform laws, policies, programs, and that affects housing and homelessness situation in Canada. And lastly, obviously, the Minister of Housing, who receives all these findings, recommendations from the Housing Advocate and the National Housing Council and the review panel. And their job is to respond within 120 days through a report that is tabled before the House of Commons and also the Senate. So that's how the mechanism works. So before I end, I just want to mention that we already had 2 review panels, which heard 2 different systemic housing issues. One was on financialization of rental housing, which is like treating housing as a commodity. I think we are hearing that in several panels here, and we are hearing more and more about the affordability aspect of housing. And the second was on challenges experienced by women and gender diverse people in accessing housing. So one interesting thing was that the panel on financialization of rental housing highlighted 2 major solutions, amongst other. So one of the things was to build more community housing, which again we are hearing in this conference in several sessions. Another was to ensure rental protections across the country. So I think many of you have already heard that the new government has introduced a promising initiative called Build Canada Homes, a major infrastructure endeavor. But there's also a renter bill of rights, which is very critical piece to the renter protections. And why I say this, because you can never fill a bathtub without plugging the leak in it. And that means without strengthening the renters' protections across Canada, you would not be able to fully claim right to housing. So it's important for us to even focus on the right to the renter bill of rights, which we will just hear from Sarah and Yutaka. And before I hand it over to Yutaka, I have another Mentimeter, and I hope this time also it works. Okay, so, it didn't work. It did. So since we're going to talk about the ununiformness of the rental protections across the Canada, we want to know that which province or territory you live in, and if you can just share your responses, and then we can just display that. And then it's over to you. Thank you.
You should be able to scroll down, Yutaka.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Ambalika. It's great to see that there are people from across Canada here. So the right to housing is implemented and advanced by governments through policy, program, and law. So we can see how the right to housing is realized piece by all orders of government at the federal level, at the provincial or territorial level, and in our cities. Together, these policies, programs, and laws provide the picture of how well Canada, or how poorly Canada, is realizing the right to housing. So I'm not going to go through this entire list, but some of the examples on this list arise from the National Housing Strategies Act, which Ambalika talked about, but many of them predate the NHSA. So when we talk about human rights or the right to housing, we should be clear, notwithstanding what Ambalika said earlier, that these rights pre-exist any laws or policies that governments use to enshrine them. They were articulated first by people who held them as values or guided their work or their lives, or because they were facing harm or a violation of those ideals. So human rights in law and in policy were established over many, many decades by governments in response to the organizing, advocacy, social movements, support of our principled political leaders, and advocacy of people who are affected by these problems, affected by this oppression, affected by housing insecurity. When we talk about the National Housing Strategies Act, we can point to the Tenant case, which I was involved in as a member of as a staff member at the Advocacy Center of Tenants Ontario, who represented the claimants in the case. But also we can point to the work of the Toronto Disaster Relief Committee in the 1990s that called homelessness a national disaster and called for the establishment of a National Housing Strategy Act. We can talk about the Red Tent campaign, which I know some of you in the room were involved in, which is a national campaign to push the federal government to recognize the right to housing and to establish a National Housing Strategy Act in the 2000s. So it's that work that people have of articulating the rights and pressing government to actually enshrine them in law, which gives us these legal rights, but we have to be clear that these rights pre-exist and exist whether or not governments recognize them or whether or not governments fulfill their duties to enshrine them. So some of these rights also, when you look at them, actually around right to housing, so the human rights codes that prevent discrimination in housing, weren't even primarily pushed by people around housing insecurity. They were sort of in response to people organizing around oppression that they faced because of their ethnicity, their gender, their sexuality, their disability, and housing was one way that they were being marginalized or one way that they were being discriminated against. So all these things together are different ways that governments can realize the right to adequate housing. So I think we have another Mentimeter question here. Just a quick one. How do you feel your province is doing in terms of protecting renters? Shocking. Okay.
What are we using?
Whoa. So it's clear that many of you share my opinion that governments aren't doing enough to protect renters' rights across Canada. Having said that, I'm going to go over in the next few slides some of the renter protections that can and in some cases do exist across Canada and how they relate to the 7 elements of the right to housing that Ambalika touched on before. So, some of these, the programs and policies and laws are on the left, and then the elements of the right to adequate housing are on the right. And these examples may be examples that different levels of government, the federal government, the municipal governments, or the provincial governments can enact. Some of them, all levels of government can enact, and some of them, because of our division of powers, only some orders of government are able to enact. So just looking at rent regulation and assistance really relate to the elements of security of tenure and affordability. So rent regulation can, of course, prevent huge rent hikes and protect affordability in that sense, but it's also key in terms of protecting the security of tenure, right? If someone can afford to live in their place, but then is hit with a rent increase of 200%, they can no longer afford to live there and they're being economically evicted. So rent regulation for sitting tenants is a key way to protect not just the affordability of rental housing generally, but the security of tenure for sitting tenants. I'll get into this a little bit in more detail in a few slides, but rent regulation in Canada is very uneven. It's a provincial matter and it's very different depending on where people live. Rental assistance is a program that any level of government could be involved in, like we have the Canada Housing Benefit. And for example, like rent banks, which haven't been around that long. The first one was created by Toronto in 1998, now exist as a province-wide rent bank where people can access funds to pay rent arrears as they're facing eviction in British Columbia, Manitoba, and New Brunswick, but there are also other rent banks that are sort of municipally at the municipal level. Security of tenure is a core element of the right to housing. Ambalika talked about it, but it's the right not to be evicted from your home except as a last resort, only through due process for a legitimate reason. And the consequences of that eviction must be considered and be proportionate to the legitimate objective. That means that other less severe alternatives to eviction must be considered. It's not a given that just because the landlord owns the rental property that their property rights override the right to adequate or the right to housing that renters have. So the implementation of this legal principle, which legal experts call proportionality, is very uneven across the country. A few provinces and territories explicitly allow adjudicators at the rental housing tribunals to consider proportionality when deciding an eviction, saying so like they have to consider how this will affect the tenant and if there are other ways to address the issue that might lead to the eviction, but in no province is this made mandatory. So that's an example of a change that would be substantial, that would help better protect security of tenure across Canada. Other policies mentioned here are similarly a patchwork across Canada. So for example, Toronto's recently introduced rent eviction bylaw is one of only a few rent evictions bylaws across the country. When we look at habitability and accessibility, property standards legislation is one way that we protect, or governments can protect, the sort of condition of housing for tenants and people living in rental and other forms of housing. Also, and most municipalities have some form of property standards legislation. Provincial human rights codes generally protect against discrimination, though as many people I'm sure in this room know, how well people can access that legislation and how proactive it is very limited. But then of course there are other laws in different provinces that protect around accessibility and adaptation for people with disabilities. So these are just some sort of clear examples of the kind of policies and kind of laws that governments could, and sometimes do enact to realize the right to adequate housing across the country. But of course, legislation is only so good as its implementation or its enforcement. So we need to ensure that these rights are actually respected and that they're actually accessible to those people who need them. So that can involve accessible legal processes and institutions. So most provinces have some form of dispute resolution that adjudicates disputes between landlords and tenants. Unfortunately, most of them are not proactive. They're complaint driven and they're reactive. They're also, in most cases, hard for tenants to navigate, or they interpret the laws that create them and the laws that they're supposed to administer, or the policies in ways, in the opinion of many tenant advocates, that are biased or that are unbalanced in favor of landlords as opposed to tenants. So, and then there are efforts by governments like Bill 60, just introduced by the Ford government, which actually further reduce and erode access to justice here in Ontario, or will if they are passed. It would speed up evictions. It would reduce the ability for tenants to raise repair issues in arrears applications, and so really restricts access to justice as opposed to expanding it. Also, there's other things that governments can do in terms of supporting the activity of rights holders, of tenants, of people who are unhoused, to actually have their rights respected. So as an example, there are very few residential tenancies acts across the country that actually explicitly protect the rights of tenants to organize associations or organize tenant unions. And I don't think any of them allow for sort of group bargaining or tenant bargaining vis-a-vis the landlord. And there are very few resources to support organizing by tenants or organizing by people who are unhoused to ensure their rights are respected. So having said all that, I'm curious to know what other things you think are needed of improvement across the country.
Sorry, I'm so captivated. Totally makes sense. Huh.
So, unsurprisingly, rent and affordability was one of the sort of key responses that you raised. And so I just wanted to provide a really brief case study or a really brief example of this patchwork of protections across the country using rent and rent regulation as an example. So you can see here, these are all the provinces and territories. Those that don't have any form of rent regulation, those have some rent regulation, and and one that has sort of a temporary rent cap. Having said that, no rent regulation, there is a tiny bit of regulating of rents all across the country, which is every province or territory establishes sort of how often landlords can raise the rent for sitting tenants. In almost every province, that's once every 12 months. Saskatchewan is an outlier. Saskatchewan actually allows, after the first year of tenancy, rents to be increased every 6 months. For many, not all, but many tenancies across the province. Looking at the most common form of rent regulation across Canada is a guideline. Those of you who are Ontario, and I know that many of you in the room will be familiar with the guideline, so that it says it's the amount of money, or the percent that the province decides that landlords are allowed to raise the rent for sitting tenants. It's based on increases in the CPI, and it, in most cases, just affects sitting tenants. Some provinces protect against rent increases between tenancies, so a tenant might leave and the rent can't increase or can only increase by an amount sort of relative to other units in the building when that tenant leaves, though most provinces don't, even if they have rent regulation. So the only provinces that have a form of what we call vacancy control are Manitoba, Quebec, and Prince Edward Island. Even those provinces and territories there in the blue have some exemptions to which units are covered by rent regulation. In Manitoba, for example, if a building is built within the last 20 years, it's not subject to rent regulation. In Ontario, any buildings built after November 2018 aren't exempt or are exempt from rent regulation. So that means moving forward, all buildings built after those tenants don't have any rights to protection for rent increases. And then, of course, as many people know, even buildings that are subject to rent regulation, landlords in most provinces are allowed to raise the rent above the guideline amount if they're able to prove that they have increased costs, or if they make repairs to the building or things like that and apply for something called an above guideline rent increase. So there's definitely a patchwork of rental regulation or rent protections across the country, with some provinces and territories having much better protections than others. But just to give an example of what this actually looks like in practice, let's take an imaginary tenant. Sarah lives in every single province and territory across the country at the same time. She lives in the same apartment, which she pays $1,000 for her one-bedroom apartment. But she lives in a neighborhood that's rapidly gentrifying. Her landlord looks around, and even though Sarah's lived there for a long time and she's been paying rent every month diligently, she's a great tenant, the landlord says, wait a second, like other buildings, other units that look exactly like the one I'm renting you are fetching like $1,300, $1,200 right now. I want to raise the rent 25% to $1,250. So what does that look like depending on where she lives? And I will just move this really quickly. This is the amount, the legal rent possible in that scenario in every province and territory across the country, based on the 2025 guideline in those provinces, if they have a guideline, or in the case of all of the places in red that have no guideline. The landlord would be able to say, hey, your rent, when I'm able to renew it, is going to be $1,250, and that would be the legal rent in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Nunavut, Newfoundland.
So Ontario too, if it was built after 2018.
Oh yes.
So there's no rent control after 2018.
Yes. As I said, there's that exemption, and that would be true in Manitoba if the unit was built in the last 20 years. And so yes, there are certainly, as I mentioned, exemptions. But of course, in Ontario, British Columbia, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, even if they were covered by the guideline, because there is what they call vacancy decontrol, the landlord would now have a real motivation to find a way to evict that tenant. Because they say, well, the legal rent is $1,025. That's all I can get based on the guideline in Ontario. But if I find a way to get you out, the next tenant, I can get them to pay $1,250 or even more if they're willing to pay it. And so this really, I think, illustrates the problem with rent regulation across the country, the problem with the lack of any kind of minimum standards to protect tenants across the province or across the country. We have a tenant who is the exact same person, exact same unit. The only thing that's different is where they live, and that impacts them greatly. So that's something I think Sarah's going to talk about in the next bit of our presentation.
Okay, thank you so much, Yutaka and Ambalaka and Michelle, and everyone for being here. So, thinking about these real disparities in renter protections across the country, our work at CCHR, and I know many of you in this room too, has really focused on ensuring renters are protected from things like excessive rent increases and unfair evictions and discrimination, all of the other issues we heard about in the poll as well across the country. And as Yutaka mentioned, we're really focused on trying to establish some minimum standards for what every renter should have access to, no matter where they live. And we know also that in the context of rising costs and few affordable options, when renters are not well protected in their homes, that's really driving increases in housing insecurity and homelessness across the country. So with all of this in mind, we wanted to take some time to talk about Canada's Renters' Bill of Rights, what it means for renter protections across the country, and ongoing advocacy opportunities to ensure renters have access to the rights and protections that they deserve, regardless of where they live. So just a bit of context setting at the very beginning here. For those that might not be familiar, in spring of 2024, the federal government announced that it was going to develop what they called a Renters' Bill of Rights. They didn't release too many details at the time, but those of us in the sector saw this as a really critical opportunity to establish those minimum standards for renter protections at the national level. Later that fall of 2024, the Renters' Bill of Rights was released as a blueprint or kind of a policy statement from the federal government, and it outlines the government's objectives to support fair and well-functioning renting systems across Canada and build a national consensus to protect renters. It includes these 4 principles, so ensuring everyone has a safe and affordable place to call home, fostering fairness and transparency, addressing inequity and discrimination, and safeguarding the rental housing system. So, somewhat responsive to a lot of the issues that we've heard about so far in the presentation. And we'll get a little bit more into the content of the blueprint and its limitations in a little bit. So after the federal government announced that it was going to be developing a Renters' Bill of Rights, our organization brought together housing organizations and tenant groups from across the country, and we did work with the Federal Housing Minister's office at the time as they were developing the Renters' Bill of Rights. There were unfortunately not a lot of opportunities for broader public consultations with tenants and other advocates at the time because the federal government wanted to develop the Renters' Bill of Rights quite quickly so that they could bring it into negotiations with the provinces and territories as a condition for them to access, at the time, what was new kind of federal infrastructure funding. And, as has been alluded to throughout the presentation, this is a really important piece of the puzzle because most landlord and tenant matters are governed by provincial and territorial laws. And that is why we see these huge disparities between different provinces and territories when it comes to renter protections. So while the federal government can propose solutions and attach conditions to funding, lots of other things the federal government can do, which we'll talk a little bit about more shortly. It's really ultimately up to the provinces and territories to put those into practice. But this type of intergovernmental cooperation is not unprecedented on housing. For example, over the course of 20 years after the federal government first introduced the National Building Code, it was adopted by every province and territory as a standard for building design and construction. So some precedent for us to look to in terms of federal government setting some standards and then provinces and territories actually putting those into practice. So to help inform the development of the Renters' Bill of Rights as the federal government was working on it, our team developed a series of recommendations in consultation with many folks in the room and across the sector, housing advocates, tenant leaders across the country. And our recommendations were really focused on 3 core principles. So again, reflecting what we've heard today, we think the Renters' Bill of Rights needs to take a human rights-based approach. So that means it reflects the commitments that we heard about that Canada has made towards implementing the right to housing, and that it's complemented with actions and investments that recognize housing as a human right rather than an investment vehicle. Second, it must include strong enforcement and accountability mechanisms to ensure that all renters benefit from protections, both in law, but then also in practice, and that also all renters should be afforded equal protections. So building on those core principles, we then developed a series of recommendations that reflect those 7 elements of the right to housing that you heard about earlier, and the human rights principles of equity, equality, and access to justice. So we'll go through this fairly quickly because I don't want to be too repetitive of what we have heard already, but looking at those different kind of principles, we talked about affordability, so housing costs should reflect household incomes and shouldn't interfere with renters' ability to enjoy other human rights. And like Yutaka mentioned, rent increases really should be moderate and predictable throughout and between tenancies through strong rent regulation. On security of tenure, again, highlighting that evictions should always be treated as a last resort, and also in connection with location, that rental agreements shouldn't end if renters have to leave their homes for things like renovations or repairs unless they consent to do so, and that they should be provided with adequate accommodation or compensation until they return to their homes. For habitability, we really, calling for measures to hold landlords accountable to maintain rental homes in a state of good repair, ensure that renters have access to all the necessary services that they need, and that they're safe from health, structural, and other hazards. In terms of accessibility and cultural adequacy, ensuring that there is housing that meets the needs of people with a range of disabilities and the unique needs of renters from equity-deserving communities. Again, on equity and equality, really ensuring that on both an individual and systemic level, renters are free from discrimination, harassment, and threats, both when they're looking for rental housing, but also when they're in their homes. We hear a lot about renters, facing discrimination and trying to just apply and get into a rental housing, but also when they're in their housing, that they are being targeted by their landlord or in some cases other tenants too, because of who they are. And then on access to justice, just ensuring that we really have strong enforcement and accountability mechanisms in place that account for those inherent power imbalances between landlords and tenants. So in the absence of government-led consultations on the Renters' Bill of Rights, we surveyed tenant groups and housing organizations from across Canada to make sure that those recommendations resonated and that they were really capturing, experiences of renters all across the country and really wanting to make sure that, renters in different parts of the country, their needs and what they're looking for might look different. So we wanted to make sure we could capture that as best we could. The vast majority of the respondents really endorsed our recommendations and did provide some additional context on just how important these protections are for their stability, security, to prevent homelessness, all of the things that we've heard about throughout the conference, and what governments can do to take next steps and ensure that these renter protections are in place. And so from that survey, we heard about the need for a really comprehensive suite of renter protections with really strong accountability mechanisms in place. So again, similar to things we heard about or that I mentioned earlier in terms of our recommendations, but these were some of the really top-level must-haves from tenants across the country. So strong rent regulation and protection against evictions, especially around rent evictions, strong anti-discrimination laws to protect cover all protected human rights grounds, including prohibiting discriminatory screening practices to select renters, which we've heard increasing more and more. Really clear standards about what does it mean to say something is affordable or habitable or accessible or culturally adequate. That needs to be stated really, really clearly. And then also funding to support landlord compliance for things like habitability or accessibility to make sure those costs aren't downloaded onto renters, which can happen through things like above guideline increases or rent increases generally, as Yutaka was mentioning. Also a strong advocacy point, which I know is a big point of advocacy in Quebec, and there's already some amazing work happening here, which is a public database of rental housing ownership, rent prices, property conditions, maintenance requests, and landlord compliance, so that we have access to information that can help better support tenant advocacy. Legal support for renters, so making sure that they have information and in some cases representation when they're facing an eviction or an unfair rent increase, things like that, as well as accessible channels for them to report issues without fear of retaliation, because we know a lot of times tenants often stay in really homes in such poor repair or facing terrible conditions in their homes, but because they're living so precariously, they're afraid of actually reporting those issues because they fear that might lead to an eviction. Relatedly, making sure that there's really clear, accessible information about landlord and renter rights and responsibilities, including things like education and training. well-resourced tribunals to investigate, monitor, and enforce landlord compliance, including timely dispute resolution, regular inspections, and strong penalties. An annual review and engagement with tenants to evaluate the effectiveness of the Renters' Bill of Rights, as well as measures to address the financialization of housing. Because I think, Mbalaka, you mentioned earlier, we really need, all hands-on-deck approach, combating the financialization of housing, investing in community housing, while also ensuring we have strong renter protections. And while we did get a lot of support for these recommendations from the tenant groups that we surveyed, we also heard a lot of skepticism, which I think we saw from some of our previous poll questions to the group, just about the likelihood of their province or territory actually adopting or enforcing these protections. So we'll talk a little bit more about kind of what governments can be doing to adequately support renters. So what ended up getting into the Renters' Bill of Rights? As I mentioned earlier, the federal government released their blueprint for the Renters' Bill of Rights in fall 2024 and includes a range of measures focused on improving fairness, equality, access, and affordability for renters. So I won't go through all of this, but just to say there was quite a significant amount in the Renters' Bill of Rights that was quite responsive to what we heard from tenant groups and from the advocacy that, us on stage and those in the audience also were really involved in. So, definitely some really promising things in there. And I would say, also importantly, the blueprint was really framed around the shared responsibilities of all levels of government to advance the right to housing through strong renter protections alongside things like investments in community housing. All that to say, there were some gaps that we saw in the final blueprint that the federal government released in the Renters' Bill of Rights. So a few key areas. First, we didn't see any real clear language around strong rent regulation provisions, including around things like rent control and vacancy control. And, as Yutaka described earlier, and as we saw in the poll results, these are such critical issues to protect existing affordability in the rental market, security of tenure for renters, to help prevent, displacement and evictions and homelessness, and has really and continues to be such a key focus of tenant advocacy across the country. The second key gap we found was around enforcement. So to be fair, for its part, the federal government, as I mentioned, is using the Canada Housing Infrastructure Fund as an incentive for provinces and territories to adopt elements of the Renters' Bill of Rights. And there are some reporting requirements from the provinces around that, which is definitely promising. But the blueprint, it doesn't say that every province and territory must adopt everything that's in the Renters' Bill of Rights. So, we still have some places to go there with that, and we have some actions we can take around this that Michelle will talk about in a little bit. And then, just the last piece that we really noticed is that the blueprint doesn't really contend with the fact that renter protections look very different in different parts of the country, as Yutaka was talking about earlier. So in some provinces like Quebec and Manitoba, for example, a lot of the protections that are outlined in the Renters' Bill of Rights probably already exist in law to a certain extent, but they might not be properly enforced, or there might be specific changes that are needed to strengthen the renter protections in those jurisdictions. But then we also have other provinces and territories like Alberta and Newfoundland, for example, where we need very significant legislative changes to make sure that we're adequately protecting renters, as well as substantial investments in the kind of infrastructure that's required to uphold those rights. So things like tribunals that deal with landlord and tenant issues and other human rights issues more broadly. So just to wrap up on this, there's lots more to do to ensure that we see those minimum standards for renter protections across the country. But we know that there's things that all levels of government can be doing to improve and strengthen renter rights across the country. So in addition to the Renters' Bill of Rights, the federal government has many tools at its disposal to ensure that renters have access to safe, secure, and affordable affordable homes. So they can do things like restrict access to funding by other levels of government, private and nonprofit actors to housing projects and policies that meet really high standards for renter protection. So like they're doing through the Canada Housing Infrastructure Fund, tying that to the Renters' Bill of Rights. And we're hearing a lot about this new Build Canada Homes program, but lots more to learn about that. And a lot of tenant advocacy is really focused on, if we're going to be providing all of this funding to build new housing, let's make sure that there are really strong tenant protections connected to that funding. Relatedly, the federal government can also develop strong accountability mechanisms to measure and evaluate progress on upholding renters' rights, setting clear targets and timelines, monitoring progress, publishing reports, and providing those meaningful opportunities for engagement. Also, as we heard about earlier, we have a national housing strategy that's going to be ending in just a few short years. And so that presents a really critical opportunity for the federal government to really center and enshrine the right to housing for all as kind of the cornerstone of what the National Housing Strategy does, which is very much in line with the commitments that Ambalika mentioned earlier through the National Housing Strategy Act and Canada's international commitments. And then we also have the NHSA accountability mechanisms that Ambalika mentioned. And then just finally at the provincial, territorial, and municipal level as well, many things that those levels of government can do. So changing laws and policies, like the Residential Tenancies Act at the provincial and territorial level, to set really clear and fair rent regulation rules, or at the municipal level, introducing something like an anti-rent evictions bylaw like Toronto did earlier this year. These levels of government also can prioritize and maximize investments in community housing and provide funding for things like eviction prevention programs, rent supplements, rental repair programs, things like that. Also making improvements and investments in access to justice systems to make sure that, landlords are held accountable for upholding renters' rights and there's fair, timely, meaningful resolutions. And, that public legal education piece, providing information and support so that renters are aware of their rights, landlords are aware of their responsibilities, and tenants have access to things like legal aid so that we can help level the playing field between landlords and tenants. But, harkening back to what others have mentioned, I think just underpinning all of these changes is the need for strong tenant organizing, mobilization, and advocacy. Like that is how we will be able to get these wins. So we heard a number of amazing examples from the past of how we've moved some of these things forward. In Ontario, just this past week, we saw a huge groundswell of tenant advocacy, which forced the provincial government to walk back a proposal to introduce fixed term leases, which would have effectively eliminated security of tenure in Ontario and led to a huge wave of evictions and homelessness. So that was a really powerful example of tenant advocacy. There's lots still left on the table that the Ontario government has proposed through their new legislation. So lots more work to continue pushing back on that. But just I think we should take the win of when we are able to say, like, absolutely not. This is not the way to solve the housing and homelessness crisis. So we're excited to continue that work at CCHR and with all of our partners, and think it's so important to tap into and understand what community partners across the country are leading and working with those advocacy and mobilization efforts. So we have one final question for you, and then I'll hand it to Michelle.
Okay, so I get the fun part where I get to talk about advocacy. I feel like I have about 10 minutes, about that before questions? Okay, we have to do a time check, otherwise I'll just keep talking. Okay, so, it's funny. We were preparing for this presentation last week, and then Thursday happened. I'm an advocate in Ontario, and all of a sudden we had Bill 60, and we thought, hugely problematic bill that was put forward that Sarah has just spoken to, Utaka pointed to as well. And then we had this win on Friday where one of those provisions around security of tenure looks like it's probably going to be walked back. If we had had a bit more time, I would have links to you for 2 2 campaigns that I want to encourage folks to check out, but I will name them at least right now. One is by Acorn, Ontario. They're doing some great advocacy around Bill 60. Another one is the Advocacy Centre for Tenants Ontario, ACTO. ACTO does amazing organizing in Ontario, primarily because they work with folks in legal clinics. So they're doing tenant duty councils, they're speaking to tenants. They're the people that get the phone calls of, I just got an L1 notice, I'm going to have to go to the tribunal, I might be evicted, and they're the folks who have to support them. So just to name those right now, Acorn, Ontario, and ACTO, or Advocacy Centre for Tenants Ontario, are both running campaigns on this. I'm so tempted, but I don't have time to talk about Bill 60. But I will just point out to folks, I had a conversation with folks at ACTO just yesterday to say, okay, I know that it looks like Premier Ford is walking back the security of tenure piece, but what else do we need to know? And some of the things that our colleague pointed out is that there still are hugely problematic elements to this bill. So we do want to celebrate the win. We always have to celebrate the wins on the right to housing movement. However, there's still a much shorter notice period, there's a shortened arrears notice period. The tenant will now have 7 days to come up with money to avoid an eviction hearing. It looks like there's a shorter period for decisions to be reviewed. It's also going to remove some of the compensation potentially that tenants might receive if they get a run eviction notice. So shout out to my friends in Ontario, check out those campaigns. But I do want to give folks a chance to actually look at this Mentimeter that's up here. So if folks want to pull out their phones once more to say, what else should tenant advocates do to push for stronger renter protections? So I'll give folks a chance to do that here. It's not working? Oh, really? Something was going to happen technology-wise, eh? Let's see. How about now? If people can use the code, is that going to work? It works now. I just needed to press next slide. Okay, all right, Mercury, okay. All right, folks. If you want to put up any ideas up here, I'm curious to see what folks think. If anyone needs a phone, I've got one here. Be a good tenant, okay. Form tenant unions, have them legally recognized for sure. Sure, yes, you could get a law degree. Or, a lot of community legal workers come from the advocacy sector. Yeah, don't get similar Bill 60 ideas. It's interesting though, because the fixed term lease... The fixed term lease discussion is also happening a lot in the Maritime. But that is interesting, yeah. As for a rental registry, yeah. Okay, target MPs and MPPs who are landlords, yep. Pushing for measures that bar elected officials from holding financial interests in rental or investment properties, yes. Pushing for comprehensive, concrete wins in the Tenant Bill of Rights, absolutely. Someone mentioned tenant organizing, and I only have 10 minutes. Okay, but I will just point out to folks, an interesting win we also got in budget 2024 from the federal government is called the Tenant Protection Fund. It's a program that was created by the federal government. It flowed over to the Department of Justice, and it was a fund for tenant organizing across the country. I've heard from a couple of different folks who have received some funding from this. We're pushing them to expand that fund because it has been a fairly successful program and has also supported a couple of local legal services to help support tenants who might be getting eviction notices. Okay, well, I will flip us back here to how can you get involved? Okay, so, I'll say it's an interesting thing to be in the federal advocacy movement and be talking about renter protections. But, as Ambalika pointed out earlier, so much of the housing sector right now is focused on Build Canada Homes, right? On this important call to make sure that Build Canada Homes is set up to actually build affordable housing, primarily by community housing providers, so public housing, social housing, cooperative housing, public land trusts. That's a big focus of our sector right now, is on building, which is great. We support that completely. However, if we're not protecting existing rental housing stock, then the plug is open on the bathtub. So we're pouring water, as Ambalika said, into the bathtub with this new potentially affordable housing stock, and all of the existing affordable housing stock could disappear. And that's what we see when we see provisions like Bill 60. So something that we have been doing over at the National Right to Housing Network is we've really been working with a lot of our partners, with CCHR, with others, to figure out how do we get the federal government to intervene in something that is really primarily provincial and territorial and municipal, arguably, jurisdiction. And we've done a lot of this work through the Renter Bill of Rights, through the Tenant Protection Fund, and now we have this opportunity to show the federal government what happens when they don't show leadership and create some accountability for provinces and territories. Because we see Premier Ford introducing Bill 60, and without a lever for the federal government to act, there's a lot of harm that could happen, and the gains we might get from Build Canada Homes might just not be seen at all if we don't have those renter protections. So with that, we are doing a new mode campaign right now. What is a new mode campaign? I say that all the time, and I realize that's not very accessible. I'm sorry. We're doing an open letter campaign. We have a QR code up here, so I'll encourage folks to take a look at that. And I will show you what this looks like. So the idea is we have a landing page here on our website, and there is a letter that you can send to the Minister of Housing in Canada. You can send it. It'll also go to the Prime Minister's office as well as your local Member of Parliament. And in it, we have a letter that you can check out that talks a little bit about the Renter Bill of Rights and the way that we need the federal government to step up, to take leadership, and hold provinces and territories accountable to their human rights obligations, right? Ambalika started this off talking about the National Housing Strategy Act, this legislative requirement that falls on the federal government, provinces, territories, local governments. We were talking about the right to housing. So how do we get the federal government to step up? We do that through mechanisms like the Renter Bill of Rights, and we need them to focus on those renter protections while they're also doing this work in building affordable housing through Build Canada Homes. Okay. Well, then last but not least, yes, I'll put that QR code up there for one more second if folks want to check it out. We have a lot of QR codes in this presentation. We are tech. We're getting better at tech, yes. So last but not least, just wanted to thank everybody so much for being in this session today, for talking about renter protections across the country. As Ambalika noted at the start of the presentation, she and I are with the National Right to Housing Network. You can see some of our colleagues all in matching t-shirts today. If you want to learn more about what's happening across the movement in Canada on the right to housing, we do send out a really, really good newsletter. No pressure, Jess. We send out a newsletter every 2 weeks that gives updates on what's happening across the country. There's a code for that now, and also, conveniently, on the back of our t-shirts, another QR code, but there is a code there if folks want to sign up for our newsletter and stay up to date. We try to give a good vision of what's happening, not just with the National Right to Housing Network, but all across different levels of advocacy. And also I want to give folks some contact information for our amazing colleagues at the Canadian Centre for Housing Rights, which can be found right here. And I think with that, I'm passing it back to Ambalika for any questions, I imagine? Yeah? And the stickers on the table are absolutely for you to take. Just important.
Sorry, we don't have a QR code.
Okay, I know we all spoke a lot. Any questions? Yes, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Arielle Trosser. I'm a city councillor in Ottawa. I just want to give a pitch because I have a workshop coming up at 1:45. It is in room 518, and one of the panelists is from Hamilton Acorn speaking about how they got there. Oh. Hi again, sorry. Hamilton Acorn representative will be on that panel talking about how Hamilton achieved its rent eviction bylaw. I've been leading the charge in Ottawa, but I have to tell you, it's very frustrating to be a creature of the province. And the biggest barrier I'm facing in trying to pass a rent eviction bylaw is this idea of the municipality just taking on more that the province should actually be doing, right? Because it's like, do we have to set up a whole regulation regime? Do we have to spend millions of dollars just to ensure that people don't get kicked out of their homes? But right now we're losing 31 affordable apartments for everyone we build, 31. And there are no apartments on the open market under $1,000 right now. So when I looked at your numbers of $1,000, right now a one bedroom is going for $2,500 in Ottawa. Yeah. Anyway, so thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I'll admit my skepticism because the province is going to do what it wants. I don't know that they would adhere to a federal housing bill of rights, although I do think that making it a condition of receiving funding might be our best hope.
Yeah.
Yep.
Not to be pessimistic, because it's still a big victory.
Yeah.
I just don't trust this government.
And just to say, Ontario, I think, is one of the provinces that has not yet signed the infrastructure the agreement.
Yes.
So, yeah. But some of them have, so we have to, push them to say what they're actually committing to.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm Bryony Halpin, manager of the Poverty Reduction Office at the City of Toronto. And I just have a question about, speaking to this jurisdictional challenge that we all face with human rights. I'm wondering about the alignment with provincial and territorial commissions and human rights codes, because largely they are mostly discrimination-based, of course, but they do have the infrastructure. They do have quasi-constitutional legal mandates in provinces to protect human rights. And I'm curious, why are they not as involved in this conversation? Because as a force across the country, they have quite a bit of influence. And they have jurisdiction over human rights in the provinces. So I'm curious, what about bringing them into the tent? You likely already have to a certain degree, and of course all the codes are diverse across the provinces. But I'm always interested in thinking about the scaffolding that already exists, the legal scaffolding that already exists, and how we can leverage that.
Do you want me to tackle? What are you feeling?
If you want to.
You want me to?
Sure.
I'm also happy if you guys do. Okay.
Go for it.
That's an excellent question. A couple of thoughts that I have off the top. So one is that I think you're quite right that provinces and territories, typically their human rights codes are discrimination based. So, so for example, it could be that, a tenant might be able to go to a human rights tribunal if they face discrimination based on race or gender or sexual orientation when they're trying to get an apartment from a landlord. So in that case, that's where we've seen some of the interactions. I think that you're probably right that the national or the provincial and territorial human rights institutions might be really, really strong allies in this context. One problem is that they're very underfunded. They're underfunded and they have a lot of files that they are handling right now. But I will say, one thing we have found a lot of strength with is in the Canadian Human Rights Commission, having the federal housing advocate housed there, I think has allowed us to have more conversations with the Canadian Human Rights Commission than we would have previously. So, it might also be a question for the movement of, do we push for provincial or territorial right to housing legislation, maybe in more rights forward provinces and territories like Manitoba, for example. Is there an opportunity there, and then to breach that is the accountability mechanism? But there probably should be more allyship with the human rights commissions, and I take that point.
Any other question?
So I'm conducting a study on the mass evictions that happened at Heron Gate in Ottawa. So I was very much informed by this presentation. Thank you very much for all the details that you have presented. So one of the things that I was always curious about was the protection against rent evictions and the financialization based on the Heron Gate case of that happened in 2015. So I was very happy to hear about the National Bill of Rights, and I hope that it will culminate into a legal protection that can be enforced against any rent evictions. But my question really is about, given the case study that I've given of the Heron Gate mass eviction, one of the issues that we came around in the literature is about how families are disrupted through these rent evictions. And I'm coming from a community development perspective and doing a community engaged study on that. I'm curious about how we can strengthen communities to be able to protect themselves through awareness creation of their rights, so that communities are aware, structurally vulnerable communities can be protected by creation of rights, because some of the problems that they face is that they do not know their rights, and there's not much advocacy to empower communities and to develop capacities to protect these structurally vulnerable communities. So my question is, does the National Rights to Housing have any comprehensive, perhaps, list of resources that we can share through community capacity building to develop the capacity of people, for example, in matters of creating awareness of their rights, what legal protection they can get, psychologically as well, like those families or communities that are still residing in Heron Gate community but are fearful of being evicted, so that we can also create that knowledge and also the psychological support and any other resources that are useful. I will be very grateful to that. And lastly, at Carlton, we are holding a housing symposium on the 24th of March. So those who are in Ottawa, feel free to join us for a dialogue and to continue this dialogue about housing. Thank you so much.
Maybe I can just say quickly, so much there, but at CCHR, we do have a team of educators who do work with tenants and do education and training sessions for tenants to know their rights. So if you're interested, happy to chat and we can put you in touch with that team. But then there are, I think what most folks would say too is the organizing, right? Like tenants coming together, working together to push for their rights and understand what their rights are so that they can stand up to, these really discriminatory practices. And I know there are, organizations like ACORN and others that help tenants come together and work together to understand those things too.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add, I think addressing the problem of fear of when you're in that situation, from my experience working with tenants and just from organizing across and the experience of social movements across the country, that fear gets lessened when people act collectively, when people get together and not just know about their rights in theory, but actually start pushing and fighting for them to be recognized in practice. And so that confidence to act collectively and that sort of confidence that they can fight these problems, that they can win or they can at least defend their communities, really comes through the act of doing it, and that fear gets lessened. And so really it's through the organizing work that tenants do and people who are unhoused do and social movements do that we can push back against the fear. It's not just knowing that we have rights, but it's actually fighting for them that helps us fight for them more.
Any other question?
Hi. Oh, can you hear me? Hi, my name's Annalisa. I'm from the Canadian Mental Health Association in the Peel-Dufferin region in Ontario. So my question is around, because of the high cost of housing kind of in our region and low vacancy rates, we have lots of clients who end up renting rooms from either the landlord or primary leaseholder, so are therefore not protected under the Residential Tenancies Act. So I'm just wondering where those individuals or those kinds of scenarios live as part of this conversation, if at all.
Yeah, it's such a huge gap in terms of renter protections. That was one of the things in our advocacy around the Renters' Bill of Rights, was that piece of protecting all renters. It shouldn't matter what your relationship is with, where you live. Same in, we see cases of transitional or supportive housing. Sometimes there's also far fewer protections for tenants in those situations. So our position is all tenants should have access to fundamental human rights regardless. And, in those cases, those are often going to be the most kind of vulnerable or marginalized tenants who are maybe more likely to face displacement or eviction or things like that. So certainly that would be part of our advocacy too. But yeah, it's a tricky piece. And we know landlords also moving in or saying that they need to move into a unit to displace tenants is also a real issue actually in Toronto, where we now have this new bylaw, which was the result of lots of tenant advocacy, helping to prevent against landlords rent evicting. Now we're a bit nervous to see what are the new tactics that landlords might be using to get tenants out, saying we need to move in and or a relative or something like that. So definitely things we're keeping an eye out for, but yeah.
Any others? If not, probably we can end the session. I know lunch is almost there. Thank you so much.